SCCS and the Climate Fringe. It's, as I said before, I mean, it's great to see so many people joining and a real variety of people joining. When we have people from the UK government, we have people from the Scottish government, we have MSPs, we have people from NGOs, we have grassroots activists, and people who have a real personal interest in this issue. So it's really great to see such a variety of people taking part. We also have people from across the world, as I've said, not least one of our speakers, Ellie, who is joining us from Fiji. It's 9 p.m. in Fiji now, so we really appreciate you taking your evening to join us, Ellie. And also this session is being recorded and will be posted as a podcast on the Climate Fringe website. So people can tune in the future as well. So wherever you are or whenever you are, you're all very, very welcome, and it's great to see so many of you here. So my name is Ben Wilson. I work for WaterAid in Scotland, and I chair the international group of Stop Climate Chaos Scotland, SCCS. So SCCS is a coalition of organisations in Scotland campaigning on the climate emergency here. And the international group is, in particular, the international development NGOs within SCCS, who have been campaigning on this issue for a number of years and has for a number of years championed climate justice. And that's mainly been focused on government. And so this group of NGOs had been campaigning for a long time for the establishment of the Climate Justice Fund, which now exists and has existed since 2012, provided by the Scottish Government. We also campaigned, partially successfully, to get the principle of climate justice into the new Climate Change Act, which was passed in 2019. And for years, really, this group has pushed for more action on climate change in Scotland on the basis of our interpretation of climate justice, which has been that it's an injustice that those who have done the least to cause this crisis suffer most, and that in the absence of more rigorous means of litigation, it is the moral and ethical duty of wealthy high emitters to retribute for past and current harm on climate vulnerable and impacted communities. However, this concept is a complex term, and it requires constant reflection. And that is the purpose of today's conversation, to explore climate justice, to explore what it means, and to think about what we can do to try to address climate injustice. So to help us do this, we've invited two excellent and experienced guests to join us in conversation. From the global perspective, we have Nishma Masivesi from Oxfam Pacfic. So Ellie is the project manager and capacity building advisor for the Regional Pacific Climate Change Collaboration. And we look forward to hearing more about that project in conversation. So Ellie's a technical expert and a trusted advisor to government agencies, to NGOs, to professionals and grassroots organisations, and brings a really strong personal as well as professional lens to the issue. From a Scottish perspective, we have Nishma Doshi, who is a grassroots activist. So Nish saw firsthand the injustice of climate change growing up and has been inspired to work since then as a community organiser, capacity builder and activist, with a particular emphasis on decolonising the climate movement. In Nish's paid work, they help marginalised groups gain access to campaign training. So welcome, Nish, and thanks for joining us. So I'm going to be pitching some questions to Nish and Ellie for probably about 30 or 40 minutes. During that conversation, it would be great if you have questions to ask to either of them. You can be thinking of them yourself, and then you can indicate in the chat box, which you should be able to access. I do hope people are familiar with Zoom by now. I guess many of us have been on a lot of Zoom calls recently. So on the bottom of the screen, you should see 3 dots, which you can click and then chat, and you can just post your question in the chat box. And when the time comes, I might then turn to you to unmute yourself and to ask that question directly to the participants. If you would rather that I asked the question, then please indicate and I can do so. For those of you who have joined since, you should see some polling, which can be reposted, I think, in the chat box, which is trying to get a sense from and what level of engagement you've had with this issue. That's the poll just come back up there. It would be great if you could complete that. And Kat and Tammy will do some some polling after as well. Yes, Kat.
Sorry, that the polling is the first time that we've tried to do this, and I'm not sure if it's working. I can't see any people have put anything in, so I'm going to just start it up again and see if it works. But apologies if the poll isn't working.
We've got polling results, Kat. We've got.
Oh,
yeah,
fantastic! Thank you.
Brilliant. And I believe there will be another question or two coming on the polls throughout, so keep an eye on that. And just to say, so this session will finish at 11. The speaking part of the session will finish at 11, but afterwards we're inviting everyone to stay for another 15-20 minutes for a more intimate conversation to reflect on what you've heard from the presentations. So that'll be facilitated by Kat and Tammy. So a few minutes before 11, I'll pass on to Kat to explain how that's going to work. But if you do have an extra 20 minutes, it would be great if you could stay on a little bit longer to reflect on what has been said. Great. I don't think there is anything else to say other than that. Please put your questions into the chat, and there are no stupid questions here. This is intended to be a really safe space for people to reflect and to learn, and we really encourage you, even if you're new to this topic, to feel comfortable here and to ask questions about things that perhaps have not been clear. With that in mind, I also ask our speakers, Ellie and Nish, to make sure to refrain from acronyms or jargon as much as possible, or to explain them when you do use them. Great, so I think now it's time to turn to our experts, and so perhaps I'll just turn to you first, Ellie, and ask you, what does climate justice mean to you personally?
Thank you very much, Ben. Thank you so much. And you know, first and foremost, let me say it's been an honor to be part of this panel to discuss issues. And also for recognizing the importance of the Pacific in your webinar and trying to hear the voices of our Pacific people. You know, sometimes it's really difficult to get the Pacific out there, but the fact that you are able to reach out, you know, it's such a great honor, and we thank you, Ben, and in particular Climate Chaos, and the people of Scotland and in the UK. Thank you so much. And a big mbula vinaka, or welcome, as we say it in our language, from across the ocean. It's midnight here, close up, probably it's not midnight, but it's 9:10 in the evening. But I must say, you know, I've been looking forward for this discussion. So thank you so much, everyone, and welcome everyone into the conversation. Thank you, Ben. So the issue of climate justice, let me just start by saying that, you know, for me personally, strengthening the voices of poor and marginalized groups so that they can engage with and influence the directions of systems and processes that we have more effectively, to allow access to the much needed resources to progressively build our resilience and bounce back from negative global crisis. Let us, most of the time the Pacific is known as small island states, or being categorized as small island states. Let me say that we are the people of the great oceans, okay? And we measure progress by important things, such as happy families, strong and healthy communities, clean oceans, and thriving gardens. We stand for climate justice. We believe that everyone should have the same opportunities, and we believe in equality. But right now, our homes, our cultures, our families, we are all facing extreme challenges and uncertainty. The climate crisis is supercharging the impacts of tropical cyclones, droughts, and floods in this part of the globe. And I must say that the rich nation, the pollution from rich nations is our real life loss and damage. Climate change and the COVID-19 pandemic, it has really re-emphasized the fragility of our Pacific economies and systems, and their acute vulnerabilities to the global phenomena. Both these disasters have continued to expose the failures in our systems and the need to change our approach to how economical, social, and ecological systems are governed. So for us here in the Pacific, real progress means climate justice for all. What does that mean? What does that mean, Ben? So for us, It means no more speeches and false commitments. You know, we're done with those things. We need progressive, transformative, and accountable systems that will bring about real and rapid climate action. That is what we need. We need a seat at the table. We need to bring people along with us. People of all abilities, women, people living with disabilities, LGBTQI communities, youth, and not forgetting our indigenous people and communities who are all tackling the shocks and uncertainties of life. So this is really critical for us, Ben. So what does climate justice really mean for us in the Pacific? We need to recognize existing traditional systems that helps us to promote, foster, and encourage the voices of marginalized, vulnerable communities to challenge these existing climate narratives that we have. Secondly, we need to put an end to this extractive behavior by challenging the accountability, the transparency of our current systems from within. It's really important, you know, if we continue to talk about the issue of we need new systems, you know, but what do we do with the current systems when we have the privilege to be working in these systems? And this is what I'm meaning here, Ben, that we need to challenge, we need to be transparent, we need to be accountable, and we need to work from within these systems. Climate justice is not just about acknowledging that there is a problem. No, we need to own the problem. We need to own this climate problem. We need to recognize that we are the creators and inheritors of this problem then. And we need a paradigm shift in how we deal with national, regional, and global systems. A system that is inclusive, that is accountable, that is transparent, and provides us the responsibility to stop the injustice that we've created and we've acquired, Ben. So when I'm talking about system, you might be asking, so what is the system that she's referring to? The system here, I'm talking about the economical, the ecological, the social system, the very systems that we've created, the systems that are being mandated by government, by states, non-state actors, and development partners globally. These are the systems that I'm referring to here. And I'll probably take you more into our discussion as we move along. Thank you, Ben.
That's great, thank you, Ellie. And absolutely, this can't just be a question of defining something. When you define an injustice, then you also need to then address that injustice. I put the same question to you, Nish. What does climate justice mean to you personally?
Thank you, Ben, and thank you, Ellie, for that beautiful answer, which covered so many things I want to say, but I'm just going to put them in a different way. For me, climate justice is about healing. It's about, often in the way that climate change is spoken about in terms of governments, in terms of NGOs, is that we need to fix the problem, we need to find solutions, we need to adapt the world to adjust to the way that we've created it. For me and for a lot of people, I think the demand for climate justice is a demand for healing, and it's a healing between our relationship with each other as people, but also our relationships with the non-human world. And the processes through which climate change have happened, I think it's important to remember that climate change is a symptom of a much more deeply rooted problem, which is the fact that we live in a world where we think we think we own and control everything. So climate change is still a symptom of that problem that we've been creating for centuries through colonialism, but it's not the problem in itself. So if we want to tackle this sort of disease of, to use poor metaphors, if we want to tackle this sort of issue of climate change, we really need to look at where it comes from. And when you start looking at where it comes from, you realize that it comes from a history of colonialism, of resource exploitation, but also of these sort of extractive relationships between the colonized and the colonizer, and also between the colonizer and the land. And these relationships is what I think we need to sort of redevelop and rebuild in order to kind of create the kind of system change, the paradigm shift that Illy was talking about, in order to kind of find a way out of this. Now, the problem with this is that it's a slower process, obviously, and the kind of situation that we're facing right now is much more urgent, and that's kind of why it's often dismissed. But I actually think that this is the fastest solution to this, and my work in particular is about changing the culture and the behavior and the practices of all of us in order to build the kind of society and build the platform and the rooted sort of grounding for climate justice to exist, for this paradigm shift to kind of happen. I've got pandemics on the brain. I think that partially this comes through like policy making, but largely it comes from massive changes in the ways in which we see global power and power relationships, because what it requires is also a massive shift in terms of like power being shifted from like the sort of top, which has been like the rich countries, the old colonizers, the whoever's on the UN Security Council, and shifting that power to be led from the people to like, for example, food sovereignty is a great movement for looking at how people are organizing and like peasants are organizing and trying to demand a food system, as opposed to like the way that the food what's it called, the Food and Agriculture Organization is proposing solutions in climate what's it called, climate safe or climate something agriculture, climate smart agriculture, and those solutions are top down, but the solutions that climate justice values, the solutions that are bottom up. It values the solutions that are about healing between all of us, and I think that's the most important thing. When I talk about climate justice, I talk about healing, I talk about our relationship with each other, and I talk about people before profit, and those are the key things which I think are most important whenever we talk about climate justice.
Absolutely, thank you, Nish. Really eloquently put. And I mean, now that both of you have had that chance to kind of frame the question, I wonder if you could maybe help us all put this into context. So perhaps I'll come to you first, Ellie, and then you, Nish, after. But could you give me some examples of how climate change affects the most marginalised? First to you, Ellie, in the Pacific, and then I'll come to you, Nish, about Scotland. How does climate justice and climate change affect the most marginalised?
Thank you, Ben. Thank you so much. From the Pacific context, climate change, climate impacts is an everyday issue. You wake up in the morning and you wouldn't know what would the climate be like come midday, or what it would be right in the afternoon. So it's an everyday, it's something that we breathe every day. You know, it's something that we see happening, and it sometimes it's difficult to explain the impact to developed nations or to the developed world, because sometimes our colleagues up in the North see it as a progressive long-term issue that would be happening, maybe 10, 15 years down the line. But for us here, it's something that is happening all the time. It's pushing those in the poverty space further into poverty. It's pushing the marginalized and the vulnerable further to an area that they would not want to be. And why, and the question again we're asking is, why is that so? It's because, and I know we've had this, the discussion that is currently now is, so what is the new normal? So we're talking about the normal and the new normal. So I just wanna bring us closer to the issue of climate justice in the Pacific, how we're perceiving it and how it's been. It's because what is perceived as normal is not the normal for us. Because every day we're seeing our families, we're seeing them being pushed to the brim in terms of the impact that they're having. And I'd like to give an example. I'll bring us back in just when the pandemic COVID-19 struck, and we had to all close our borders. And closing borders means, because majority of the Pacific Island nation, we depend on our imports, on some of the things that come from which does not mean that, we don't plant stuff. We still do. But then automatically, a week or two after that, we had tropical cyclone Harold that hit us, which was a category 4. And yet we had to take the risk. And because of that, our colleagues from the Solomon Islands who were transporting their families back because of the closure of borders, they had to be shipped back into their to some of the islands. They were caught in this, and it was said that their boats capsized, and we lost lives in that. So just these little things, some of the stories that we try to tell everyone that is listening, and it's it's an injustice. It's because we are, like I said in my earlier spiel, we are the inheritors of this problem, and as much as we're the inheritors, let us also acknowledge that we are the creators. We accept that, then only can action be. If we'll continue to say that it's a problem, let's find solution, and we don't own that problem, it's going to be very difficult for us to move into action mode, because we're not owning. We're still pointing fingers at, you created this, you clean it up, so I'm the inheritors here, and and this is what's happening, and so forth. It doesn't make any sense. We have to be working collaboratively together to allow ourselves to accept that we are the creators, inheritors of this problem, and we will fix the problem together. So I'll leave it at that, Ben. Thank you.
Absolutely, thanks, Ellie. And perhaps I'll come back to you on that point, and as we move forward to reflect on how we can try to address this. But moving to you next, Nish, how can you give some examples of how climate justice or climate change affects the most marginalised here in Scotland?
I wasn't going to answer in Scotland specifically, but
sure, that's fine. Yeah, countries like Scotland, maybe, or
yeah. I mean, I guess what's been in my mind sort of for the last few weeks have been a couple of things that have been happening while the coronavirus has been also impacting all of us. Firstly, there was the cyclone Ampam, which hit Bangladesh and India and sort of that whole region, which during this sort of crisis was doubly hard to manage. People died. There was like mass impact, and there was very little coverage by the mainstream media. The reason I'm talking about these two is because I grew up in Kenya, and my family's from India. So kind of the other example I was thinking about, and it has been on my mind, is also been the locust sort of, what's it called, problem that's been rising in East Africa, and how that's had a massive impact on food, and also some of the food that we import into Scotland ourselves. So a few of these things I've been watching and hurting and sort of crying a little bit about how the ways in which climate change is impacting the world right now, and how little interest there is in kind of looking at that impact while we are all distracted by things like our own coronavirus. But you have many spaces in the world where people are kind of having to deal with that and the everyday ongoing sort of new kind of interesting horrific kind of experience of climate change that's happening now, and that's kind of an ongoing process of having to deal with that all the time. And in that process, what you have is that you have groups which are marginalized because they have to face both the impacts of like a larger problem and a more localized problem, but the localized problems are usually impact the people who are marginalized the most. And the way that happens is, for example, with the issue around the locusts in Kenya, the communities that are impacted are communities who are by and large have their entire livelihood based on these farms, and they're not industrial agriculture farms. They're local, sustainable farms. And by this kind of locust problem that's kind of come across, which is exacerbated by issues like climate change, you have many people going really hungry and starving, and those are the same suppliers that are supplying Scotland with food. And when you have the same thing happening with across other industries. And I think it's really important when we talk about climate justice to acknowledge that it's not just about climate change, it's about all the other social justice issues that go around it. So when we're talking right now, for example, we've heard about, many of you may have heard of the scandal around Boohoo garment factory workers in Leicester, and how their work probably was one of the reasons why Leicester's had such a huge problem in terms of not being able to reduce its coronavirus levels. But the garment workers in Leicester have a similar story to the garment workers in Bangladesh, who are also being impacted by climate AMPAM. But garment workers in Bangladesh were not allowed to go down on lockdown. They had to carry on working in horrific, tiny conditions with no social distancing measures, and maybe some masks, and that's about the only thing. And that was all to supply and meet demands, which were then cancelled by UK garment companies and are leaving loads of people out of work in the rest of the world. All of these systems, all of these impacts are interconnected. And when we talk about how climate change impacts people, it impacts people where they are already precarious and therefore makes things worse. And that's the issue that really comes out of this, is the fact that we have forms in the global north of some forms of stability and some forms of resilience. For example, it's not perfect. I'm not saying that at all. I think that there are definitely things in Scotland which definitely need to change, but we have some systems of privilege here that need to be acknowledged. We do have a welfare state system, we do have the NHS. All of these are privileges for other countries. And in fact, there is a whole thing around how in the Congo in the 1980s, they had a much better health system than most other places in Africa, but that was destroyed through this sort of external state development projects that the global north had been put, because they wanted to privatize that medical industry. So I know I'm bringing up a lot of different dimensions to this, but what I'm trying to say here is that when we look at climate justice from this angle of how climate change impacts marginalized people most, we have to look at all the other intersections of how people are already marginalized and the reasons for why they're marginalized, and then go into add climate change into that as well. Because the truth is that it's a known fact that climate change is going to impact people who caused it less more. And by that we look into historic emissions and kind of go into the past of where carbon dioxide emissions and greenhouse gas emissions kind of started from, and kind of going into that into a more present day. There's a framework for this which starts looking at that, which is called the Fair Shares Framework. And I think the COP26 Coalition had run a few workshops on this, but I think if you look up climateshares.org, you should be able to find it. But within that framing, our kind of commitment towards carbon mitigation needs to be much higher than it currently is. It's much higher than Scotland's aim for 2045 net zero emissions. That's that's completely unreasonable from so many different levels. And the difference is that within the global north, and with the Paris Agreement, we all agreed to two degrees limits, but the limit that's been demanded from the global south, and has been demanded from the global south for years, has been 1.5, and it is between that tiny 0.5 difference that lies all the difference, because it is within that 0.5 difference that the global south gets heavily impacted and the global north does not significantly. And that's always been a decision that's made, and that's a decision that's made by NGOs. There's a ton of NGOs right now who are proposing 2 degrees and supporting the government's decisions around 2045. But it's not something that the global south and global south movements and global south countries have been demanding. And the reason why they don't get that same commitment is because power still lies within the global north. And we're seeing how climate change in itself has been militarized and shifting. The UN Security Council has been given more power over deciding around this sort of climate emergency than the UNFCCC. There's been a shift in power, and that means that the actual decision making around climate change and climate decisions has shifted from being sort of in a space where there was more opportunity for poorer nations and the global south to kind of get involved and into a sort of private space where there are a limited amount of seats on the Security Council, and that the seats which are constant are always the most rich and powerful countries in the world, who also have the largest carbon emissions. And this shift, this militarization of climate change, is part of this struggle, because it is a shift of thinking about climate change as something we need to fight, something we need to fix. This idea of like us versus nature, which is fundamentally where I find we really need to change. It's the root cause we really need to change, is that we have to stop seeing ourselves as being in opposition to nature, in opposition to like other people, in competition with other people, and shifting that into something that is more like about interdependency and mutual aid. A lot of the sort of ideas and a lot of the kind of local grassroots solutions that have come out of like the coronavirus, like mutual aid networks, can be applied on a broader sort of like system of like tackling climate justice and kind of bringing in climate justice, but they need to be done in a way which actually acknowledge, like that work, it needs to be invested in, and that's not something that I see currently happening.
Great. No, thank you, Nish. They're really, really interesting and helpful comments. I mean, I think you're right. This crisis needs to be viewed really in the context of history, in the context of our paradigms and the way that we see the world, but also that this is uniquely intergenerational and uniquely international, and we need to think about it like that. I'll just remind everyone now to please post questions in the chat if you do have questions. But so I'm going to ask one more question each to Ellie and Nish, and then after that I'll turn to audience questions. Perhaps I'll turn to solutions for my final question to Ellie and to Nish. So to you first, Ellie. So you mentioned in your opening remarks about the most climate vulnerable countries needing a seat at the table. And as you're aware, COP26 will happen in Glasgow next year. I wonder if you could offer any reflections about how the UNFCCC and COPs, how that process needs to improve to deliver climate justice.
Thank you, Ben. I'll just take you back, from the time when I used to be with government and, being in the negotiation spaces. I've worked 15 odd years now in this field. And last year, after for quite a while, I haven't been into the discussion on the COP. I was given the brief to attend the COP25 session, and I must say how frustrating it was for someone who had been following this 15 years ago to see that very little has happened from that time in terms of the discussion to now. The most frustrating bit for me is that the number of hours that have gone in just to be discussing text is it's painful, I must say, for someone who's coming in and seeing everything that is happening, the impacts of climate change on their small, on our small islands, on our paradise here in the Pacific, and to be sitting long hours to be discussing a simple text. Sometimes I get to feel like, is it really worth my being here? Is it really worth for me to be here while my people are suffering back home, while my Pacific Island, sisters and brothers are struggling to put food on the table, are struggling because they don't have any more land because of storm surges and coastal erosions that has been exacerbated by climate change that is coming in and taking their land away, washing their houses away. Is it really worth it? And then I come to think, and I said, if I can contribute a little to this, it will go a long way in saving my daughter's generation and her generation to come, and something that they will look back and say, I'm glad, Mom, that you were there to fight for me. I'm glad that you did not that you sacrifice the long hours of flight to be in those spaces. And I believe that that maybe one day, you know, that they will shorten the discussion, really feel what we are feeling here in the Pacific. And, you know, it's like I said, sometimes it might be difficult, but you know, it's always good to always be consistent with our messaging. And the messaging that we're coming from the Pacific is, you know, we are inheritors of this problem, and we need you to work with us so that we could help curb the impact of climate change and its impact, not only for this generation, but for the generation to come. You know, I'm happy enough that I'm able to see things that are happening, but I have a daughter that is coming up who is, you know, like I said, with tropical cyclone Harold that hit us, there was a whirlwind that came with it. And it came at midnight. It crossed the path, crossed our house. And it, you know, everything just went haywire. You know, the houses, the neighbors' houses got all flown out. You know, in the middle of the night when they're having a really nice sleep, I heard my daughter screaming from her room, coming running to me, all full shaking. You know, how do I, you know, and how do I continue to tell them this is climate change? It's happening, it's real, and it's going to be more frequent. And you got to be prepared for this. I think this is really, it's unfair. It's really unfair to be getting a child not to grow up as a normal kid, but to grow up thinking that, you know, anything can happen and she needs to be prepared for anything. And I think it's you know, and now with COP, as you've rightfully said, Ben, I'm glad that there are platforms that are out there that have recognized the importance of Indigenous issues. The Paris Agreement, there are articles that have now, for years, that, you know, we have been asking, and has now gained recognition, like loss and damage, and so forth. But there is still a problem, and this is the system that I would like to talk about. The system, the binding and the non-binding natures of the systems that we've created, like the climate change agreement. This is a form of a system. Okay, so this is such as the you know, like the Paris Agreement. Now these sort of system, it prioritizes the legality of some elements over others. For example, the intended nationally determined contribution, or the INDCs. Okay, it is recognized at national level, but it is not part of the core agreement that governs the international processes and which is binding to parties. What I'm saying here is, it's up, you know, we are accountable only nationally, but it's voluntary when it comes. And we can't afford to do that. With islands like ours, we can't, we need the recognition. If it's nationally, it has to be regional and global as well. You know, so, and we need to, we cannot continue to separate it to suit our own needs. Let's not be selfish here. You know, let's not be selfish. I'm pleading with all of us. You know, look at, you know, why are we just taking some part of it and saying, oh yes, we are recognizing, we are putting platforms out there, the Indigenous Peoples platform. But if you were there in Madrid, the Indigenous people were out in numbers and they were crying. They were actually coming out with the issues. So what's wrong with the system? Why did we create a system to recognize, yet we've never put action, we've never put resources in it? Why are they still crying out? Then that means there's something wrong with the system. So let's stop creating systems. Let's look within the system. What is wrong? And let's try and make something. Let's make a difference. Let's bridge the gap in there. So for me, this is what I want to see out of the COP process, okay? Yeah. So with all the systems that we've created, it's good, but let's stop creating them for the sake of creating them, for the sake of recognizing them. Thank you for recognizing the issue, but we need action, we need resources. You've recognized it, you've made it even harder for us to access climate finance. to uphold, to try and put our communities so that they're able to adapt in these issues. You've created the platform for discussions. There's a bid out there, the 1 billion, the Green Climate Fund that is there. These are all the platforms, the systems that we've created. But why is it harder for us now to access those funding? How is it just a tick in the box, get these things? But why are people still crying? There is something wrong with it. So, and probably I'll talk more about how we change these systems. Yeah.
Sure. Thank you so much, Elaine. I mean, one of the things you said is that I think it's an easy thing to know the impact. It's a hard thing for people to feel the impacts. And certainly after contributions like that, I hope that participants can at least somewhat feel just how urgent this is. So Nish, perhaps I'll turn to you and ask solutions focused briefly, if you don't mind, so we have time for questions from the audience. What can people do here to get involved in the solution?
So I think I mentioned at the beginning that I don't like thinking about solutions, but because I don't think that's the way to approach things. I don't think it's about fixing problems. I think it's a much longer process. I think you don't achieve climate justice. It's a process. It's an ongoing process. But in terms of like kind of reflecting back on how people in Scotland can get involved, I think the biggest thing to start off with is education. Within Scotland, we've had amazing work happening in terms of sort of ideas about alternative economies. We've had a lot of work happening in terms of projects from the Scottish government to kind of make sure that people reduce their emissions, to like things like the Climate Challenge Fund. We've had a lot of opportunities which you can tell that the Scottish government is obviously trying to do something about climate change, and there's definitely some work there and that's happening. However, a lot of this work depoliticizes climate change. When we talk about Climate Challenge Fund, that was largely a fund that was given to poorer people, largely it's poorer communities in Scotland, to reduce their carbon emissions. Now, if we look at the history of climate change, the accountability and the accountability for carbon reductions really lies within sort of much more rich, much more powerful, much more like consumerist sort of leadership, and so the mitigation really needs to happen on that level too, not just for like poor and marginalized communities. And I think one of the things that needs to happen in terms of like getting involved in Scotland is the repoliticization of this movement, but at the same time it needs to take in that global perspective. So for example, there is a great pathwork set out by Commonweal called like I think it's one of their Green New, I can't remember exactly what it's called, but it's their Green New Deal proposal. But while it is a great proposal for like helping Scotland if Scotland became independent, it completely fails to address the global and international commitments that it needs to make. And I think within Scotland, there needs to be a process of acknowledging that Scotland has been a colonizer too, and has been part of this very long, complicated process of colonization. And in fact, it was many Scottish Enlightenment thinkers who kind of created the conditions and thinking that allows for the system that we have today. At the same time, there is also a history that needs to be remembered of like the mass clearances of Scotland, of the Highlands, and this sort of process of terraforming Scotland into a land of like sheep farmers rather than people, displacing people for sheep farms. But that's a parallel that's been had with the global south too. You look at Masai Mara, the largest so-called conservation park in Kenya, and that's an area which was massively cleared in order for game reserves for colonizers, which were then, once the game reserve owners felt guilty about how many animals they'd killed, then created into like a conservation area. But it still means that mass people were displaced by that movement. when it comes to getting involved in climate justice from a Scottish basis, I think that one thing that really needs to happen is this kind of understanding of the history and the role that Scotland's played, but also understanding the history of climate change. And in order to do that, there needs to be this sort of like politicization of climate change again. We need to acknowledge that there are political reasons why climate change is happening and why there is no political will to actually change and create the paradigm shift and the sort of change in systems that we need in order to like actually survive as a global community. And that's the first step. I think the second step is also going into things like understanding our relationship in our role in that kind of climate justice movement. We need to shift and change from being sort of development sort of focused and being more bottom up focused. So currently, for example, Scotland has this climate justice fund, but it's not really a climate justice fund. It's more of a development fund that Scotland uses in the name of climate justice. It's still administered by a Scottish NGO and a number of other Scottish NGOs. It's still reproducing the same sort of like problems of power and relationship that kind of make sure that it's not actually about justice. A justice movement is led from the global south. So if Scotland wanted to make the climate justice fund an actual climate justice fund, the key thing is that we actually start allowing communities to make their own decisions on where they want to spend funding, and we actually allow them to make decisions on resources and using knowledge that's actually been gained, like local knowledges that have been gained for everyone, and putting that into practice in terms of that kind of power relationship within Scotland. As for like the general population, like the everyday person, how do you get involved in climate justice work? I think there are a lot of amazing movements coming out of Scotland, which are trying to like at least ask these sorts of questions. I've definitely seen the Climate Camp Scotland group, for example, who are doing a lot of work with Mossmoran and the gas flares, which you can also bring parallels between Mossmoran and Nigeria. And I think that's one really good way of kind of understanding climate justice, is understanding what's going on here and connecting that to what's going on elsewhere, and understanding the parallels and how we have to be in solidarity with each other. But there are groups who are doing this, and they are active, and they're trying to shift things. And that's something that's it is possible, but it's a process, and we have a lot of work still to do within Scotland to kind of get to the level that we can really move things. But in the meanwhile, our main aim is to I think what we really need to do right now is support movements from the global south, understand them, learn them, kind of experience them, build relationship, and work in solidarity rather than in competition or as administrators or in control. And that's kind of the best way I think people can get involved. But look, my suggestion to you would be get it like if you're already involved in a group, start having discussions around climate justice. If it's okay, I'd also like to hopefully I can speak to Kat or Tammy to send out like a list of resources and like connections and ways to get involved, which might be a little bit more comprehensive than what I can say right now, because saying a bunch of URLs is just not very fun for listening. So I'm happy to share that afterwards. But yeah, at the moment, I'd say like you've already got a space for, there's already climate change work going on. Change that by bringing in issues of climate justice. And that's where I think the most important work needs to happen in Scotland.
Brilliant. Thank you, Nish. And it would be really helpful to have all those links afterwards. I will now turn, you'll notice that I have gone on longer with this section rather than turn to audience questions, but I hope you all agree that it would have been a mistake to have cut short those contributions from Nish and Ellie, which were both so insightful and really helpful. But that unfortunately means that we probably only have time for about one of the questions which has come through. But remember that please, we are really warmly inviting you all to stay on after 11 for about 15 minutes, when you can break up into smaller groups and then come back together to discuss some of these questions. We had a question come in from David Coleman, who I think was first with this question. David, I wonder if you would mind unmuting yourself and then asking the question to Ellie and Nish.
Right, which one's that? The one about the blame game, or the other one?
Yes, I think. Well, yes, that was your first one, I think.
Yeah.
But you can.
Okay. Well, very pleased, to hear the emphasis in both the speakers on healing and reconciliation. How can we make climate justice? Oh, hang on. Whoops. No. There we go. Where's it gone? Just find what I've done. Have you got it there, then? Right.
Yes.
I found it. Right. Where does the balance lie between speaking out and making the issues visible and not falling into the blame game? So that you're not just angry all the time, but you are helping the people you're trying to get through to change.
Great. Thank you, David. And so in the interest of time, maybe just a brief answer from Ellie and then from Nish. Over to you, Ellie.
Thank you, Ben. Thank you so much for the question. I guess I'll speak from. There's actually two answers to that from my end, from my experience here in the Pacific. Actually, three. The first one has got to do with our human rights approach. Inherent dignity of an individual and members of the community will be the core part of what we need to do in climate justice. What does that mean? The use of existing human rights mechanisms at national, regional, and international level that helps to promote good climate justice practices, which will include dignity, equality, non-discrimination, inclusive action, social accountability. So already there are existing human rights mechanisms. And we can all help in assisting in creating the necessary changes to these existing systems to suit the current context that we're in. Like I said previously, we don't have to do anything new. The system's already there. And if only we can work together at the national, the regional, and as well as the global, we should be able to make the necessary changes. Secondly, I would like to just talk about just safeguarding. The importance of safeguarding, making sure that the existing processes, procedures, and systems that we have are accountable, transparent, and accessible. This is really important, so that we recognize that this, for those of us that work with Indigenous people or are Indigenous in nature, recognizing that we have existing informal systems such as traditional systems that play a critical role in the development of good, effective, efficient, formal systems. This needs to come in strongly. And finally is our INGO privilege. As an international INGO or as a civil society working for the government, we are in a position of power to influence, to ensure that we are genuine in the inclusion of risk and marginalized, vulnerable, and grassroots community voices, including women. We should support and accompany social movements and civil society organizations. We should act as convener, broker, and facilitators of spaces and bringing together key stakeholders so that we genuinely generate collaboration and offer new solutions to climate justice that we face. So I feel that these are three critical spaces that we could come in and don't do the blame game. Let's work with existing structures. Let's work with the traditional systems that are already, it's been there for centuries, are well known by a majority of the people that are out there, and as well as our privileges and INGO, being that convener, the broker, the facilitator, provide that space to hear those voices, and then we act in presenting those voices to the levels or areas that we work in. Yeah, thank you, Ben.
Perfect. Thank you, Ellie. And Nish?
So I'm just double checking that I'm not on mute. Classic. Yeah, I think I'm really uncomfortable with this idea of people talking about blame games, because there's a level of accountability. Like I feel like that term has often been used by the right to kind of and particularly by, and I do say this as someone who's kind of definitely an anti-capitalist, but from a decolonial perspective. I think there is definitely a way in which the blame game has this term of the blame game has definitely been used by the right to kind of sort of make words are not working, to kind of destabilize the kind of movements for liberation that have been going on. And so when we look at things like, and when we're talking about things like how to create balance and not end up in the blame game, I think the answer is definitely about accountability and about acknowledge and taking accountability. And for me, that's really important, is that we all have to take accountability for the kind of powers and privileges that we all have in terms of like our relationship to the climate change and the history of climate change. I don't think that is, I really feel uncomfortable at this use of the term blame game, because it reminds me of like the term intersectionality Olympics, which isn't a really fair assessment of what's going on and what's actually happening and what climate justice is about. It's not about a blame game, it's about equality, it's about justice, it's about accountability. And those are very clear. If you look at something like the COP25 people's demands, you're looking at a list of like very basic demands in terms of like things like being able to actually grow your own food in the way that you want to, and having that not imposed by an international corporation that's been supported by international aid agencies. For example, the UK was a huge part of this sort of new sort of Green New Deal, Green Revolution for Africa, and we have to acknowledge that we are part of these like sort of projects which are designed to kind of disempower people and marginalize people so that we can gain out of this crisis. There is a huge movement of people right now who are using the climate crisis as a way to kind of profit and taking that opportunity. And I think that those things are really important to be aware of, and understanding that it is political. Now, I don't like the use of the phrase blame game. I do like accountability. I do like an acknowledgement for history. I do believe that there are ways to kind of build healing practices into all of this, but it does require some level of discomfort for those who have historically been advantaged. And because the people who are not historically advantaged, the people who are still disadvantaged, still have to deal with that level of discomfort every day. So finding a way to kind of communicate that change in a way that is healthy and sustainable is important, but it's also important not to see that as a blame game, but see that as a way of kind of dealing with conflict and issues and finding a transformative way of healing from those sort of that history, and also building a future which we all want to live in and have a chance to live in.
Amazing. Thank you, Nish. And I really wish we could go on longer, not just because of those contributions from both of you, but because we've got some other great questions too. But unfortunately, it is now 11 o'clock. So I think what I'm going to do, so remember, don't go away yet. So if you have an extra 15 minutes, please stay on, and Kat will lead some discussions. But before we do that, what I would like to do is ask you all to unmute and maybe give a round of applause to Illy and to Nish for really fantastic and passionate and really insightful comments and conversations. So thank you very much. And thank you everyone for taking part wherever and whenever you are. We hope you will stay part of this conversation and stay in touch and take part in future events like this, and that we can all be part of this movement for change together. So thank you everyone. I'm going to pass over to Kat now, who will lead us into the extra 15-minute session. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Ben. So I'm just wanting to, I apparently need to make myself visible, and so it's not Ben being seen, and I can't work out how to do it to myself. So I'm just going to put you straight into small groups of 4 or potentially 3, and what I thought it'd be a lovely opportunity for, usually at the end of a Zoom call, you kind of drop off and you find yourself just alone in your room, and you think, you know, I kind of like a little bit of chat. I'd like to share a bit of what I felt, or just how my day's been, or just to say hello to people and meet some of the fascinating faces that you see all up on the screen. And so this time we're going to try it a bit different. We're going to just have a wee breakout room, 15 minutes. There's nothing you need to bring back to the main group to discuss. It's literally just go into your groups and get to know each other a bit, have a chat, share a bit about what you felt about this meeting, or what you're going to be doing about it, or what your plans are in the next week even. And then we're just going to come back in 15 minutes time, say goodbye to everybody, and then hopefully it won't feel like such a cliff edge to the meeting. So thank you all. I'm going to put you into random groups, so we'll just see who meets who. I'm going to, some people have already dropped off. Oh, I'm going to have to go down and make it fewer rooms so that we've got enough people in the room, because lots of people have gone. I'm not having any of that. So I'm going to put you into rooms of 3 to 4, and I will see you in 10 or 15 minutes. There we are. You've all been invited, so you just need to click join my meeting. Fantastic. So, are we in a room?
Okay, so what's your background? Oh, hi.
Well, I'm living on an island in Scotland, so not quite Fiji, but you know, you can see what's happening around you.
Where are you?
The Isle of Bute.
Yeah. That's a lot of the Scottish islands are a lot of risk, aren't they?
I mean, like many places, COVID was really interesting because it showed